January 11, 1944. Over Oschersleben, Germany. The air was burning with war. Beneath a frozen sun, a lone American fighter sliced through the hostile sky, its silver wings flashing against the clouds like a blade drawn in defiance. Inside that aircraft sat Major James Howell Howard, a 30-year-old U.S. pilot whose name, within a single half hour, would echo across every airbase in Europe. In that moment, he was not just a man in a cockpit. He was the thin line between survival and annihilation for hundreds of American airmen flying toward their target below. Howard had fought wars before this one. He had survived jungles in Asia, faced Japanese Zeros over Burma, and returned home carrying the unspoken weight of men who never made it back. Yet nothing in his life, not even the chaotic skies of China, had prepared him for what awaited above Germany that morning. It was supposed to be another escort mission, another long, cold flight guarding B-17 bombers as they made their run deep into enemy territory. But war has a way of turning routine into legend. And for James Howard, this was the day that would define him forever. 30,000 feet above the Rhine, surrounded by the thin air of the stratosphere, he flew his P-51 Mustang Dinghao into history. The plane was more than a machine. It was an extension of his instincts, a weapon built for speed, for endurance, and for the kind of courage that had no room for hesitation. Around him, the radio static carried the chaos of battle. Bombers calling for help, fighters breaking formation, and distant reports of enemy swarms rising from the east, somewhere below. The black smoke of German flak was already climbing toward the formation. Howard's heartbeat steadied as he looked out over the horizon. He knew what that haze meant. The Luftwaffe was coming, hundreds of German fighters scrambling to defend their homeland, outnumbering the Americans 10-1. It would be one of the fiercest air battles of the European campaign, and every man in the sky could sense it. But none could have imagined that before the next 30 minutes ended, one pilot, flying completely alone, would take on the enemy and carve his name into military legend by downing 12 aircraft in the span of a single fight. He had no formation left to back him, no friendly wingmen beside him, and no margin for error. Yet when the first black dots appeared on the horizon, fast, growing, spreading, he didn't turn away. The world would remember that 30-minute window as an impossible story of bravery. For Howard, it was simply duty. The horizon turned dark as the enemy appeared in a swarm of black specks, moving fast against the pale sky. To most men, that sight meant terror. To Howard, it meant clarity. 30, maybe more. German fighters were climbing toward the bomber formation like a wall of steel teeth, their engines screaming across the frozen air. The sun reflected off their canopies in sharp glints of silver and gray, each one carrying a pilot ready to die for his homeland. Below, the massive line of B-17s pushed steadily forward, burdened with bombs, heavy and vulnerable. They were easy targets, slow-moving giants unable to maneuver. Without protection, they would be slaughtered before reaching their target. Howard understood the math instantly. His squadron had been scattered, drawn off by smaller dogfights miles away. There was no one left to guard the bombers. No one but him. The weight of that realization would have frozen most men. But Howard was not built like most. His mind quieted, and the world seemed to narrow into a tunnel. Only the hum of his Merlin engine and the steady vibration of his P-51 mattered now. He pushed the throttle forward until the plane surged with raw power. Alone, he began to climb toward the oncoming storm. The first pass was over in seconds. Howard dove through the formation of Messerschmitts, his guns erupting in bright streams of tracers. A German fighter caught the full burst across its fuselage and disintegrated mid-air, scattering metal into the sky. Another tried to bank away, but Howard adjusted his line with surgical precision, tearing into its wing until the aircraft tumbled downward in flames. There was no hesitation, no fear, and only movement, calculation, and fire. He rolled inverted, pulled up, and re-engaged before the smoke of the first kill had cleared. Around him the bombers kept formation, their gunners shouting into radios, watching in disbelief, as a single silver fighter danced through a sky filled with enemies. It seemed impossible. One American pilot charging straight into 30 German planes, but the proof was there, written in the burning contrails that spiraled toward the ground. The Luftwaffe pilots quickly realized that this lone Mustang was not retreating, not defending but attacking. They broke formation to hunt him down. The sky became a storm of steel. Cannon shells burst around Howard's plane, shattering the air with shockwaves. Shards of flak and smoke tore past his canopy as he twisted through the chaos, chasing fleeting silhouettes across the horizon. Every movement was instinctive, born from thousands of hours in the air and the hard lessons of earlier wars. His left hand adjusted the throttle, while his right controlled the stick. With smooth precision, he moved with the rhythm of survival. Climb, roll, dive, fire. Climb again. His Mustang rattled with strain, the engine screaming under full power, yet it felt almost alive beneath him. Another German fighter flashed across his gun sight. A Focke-Wulf, Hun-90 banking hard to attack the lead bomber. Howard swung in behind it, squeezed the trigger, and watched the tracers find their mark. The aircraft burst into fire, its pilot bailing out too late. Howard didn't linger to see it fall. He was already chasing the next. The clock inside his cockpit ticked past 15 minutes. He had been fighting alone for what felt like hours. His fuel was dropping rapidly, and his ammunition counters were nearly half empty. But every time he looked down, the bombers were still there, still flying, still alive. That was enough. He knew the longer he kept the enemy busy, the fewer attacks they could make on those slow-moving fortresses. He became a moving shield, drawing the German fighters toward himself like gravity. The Luftwaffe regrouped, determined to end the lone American's defiance. From below, 5 fighters rose in formation to cut him off. From above, 3 more dove to intercept. The trap was perfect, or should have been. Howard saw it unfolding seconds before it closed and turned directly into the attack. His Mustang cut through the formation with the ferocity of a hawk through a flock. One fighter burst apart under a perfect burst of fire. Another clipped its own wingmate while trying to avoid him, both spiraling away in smoke. In less than a minute, 3 aircraft were gone, the others scattering in confusion. He could feel the fatigue now, the physical weight of the G-forces pressing against his body, the trembling of his hands as adrenaline flooded his veins. The oxygen mask grew damp with sweat, and every muscle in his neck burned as he scanned the sky for the next target. But he refused to yield. His mind was locked on one purpose: hold the line until the bombers made it out. The Germans returned again, more cautious now, circling him from a distance. Their coordination weakened, their aggression dulled by disbelief. They had never seen anything like this. One American fighter refusing to retreat, striking again and again, fearless and unrelenting. Howard climbed above them once more, dove headfirst through their circle, and fired until his guns clicked dry. Smoke and flame marked another kill. When his ammunition finally ran out, Howard didn't turn for home. He stayed above the bombers, weaving back and forth, bluffing with empty guns to keep the Germans away. The Luftwaffe pilots, uncertain of how much fight he had left, hesitated. That hesitation saved lives. By the time reinforcements from the 354th Fighter Group arrived minutes later, the German attack had broken off. The bombers, though battered, were still intact. They had made it through. When Howard finally descended through the cloud cover, his Mustang was scarred with bullet holes, oil streaked across the fuselage. One wing was punctured clean through. But the engine still roared and the aircraft still obeyed. He had been in combat for just over 30 minutes, that had rewritten the definition of bravery in the air. 12 enemy planes had fallen to his guns. Dozens more had turned away. Hundreds of bomber crewmen owed their lives to that single act of defiance. Back at base, ground crews stood silent as his battered Mustang rolled to a stop. The canopy lifted and Howard climbed out, exhausted and wordless. He was not a man who needed applause, not someone who measured worth in victories. He had simply done what duty demanded. But the story spread faster than any rumor, from airfields in England to command rooms in Washington. Pilots spoke his name with awe. Newspapers called him the lone wolf over Oschersleben. He had gone into the sky alone and returned as a legend. The mission was over. But the silence that followed was heavier than the battle itself. When Major James Howard landed back in England that afternoon, the airfield felt almost too calm, too still for what had just happened. Mechanics rushed toward his plane, staring at the shredded metal, the bullet holes that riddled the wings, the smoke-stained fuselage, and the dark streaks of oil running along the body. It was the kind of damage that told the story before a single word was spoken. Yet through it all, the name Ding Hao remained visible on the nose, defiant, unbroken, almost symbolic of the man who had flown it. Howard climbed down from the cockpit with slow, deliberate movement, his body drained, his flight suit soaked in sweat despite the bitter cold. The weight of exhaustion had finally caught him. His hands trembled as he removed his gloves, his face pale but expressionless. There were no cheers, no grand gestures waiting for him. The other pilots who had already returned simply watched in quiet disbelief. They had seen the chaos from a distance, heard fragments of the radio calls, and spotted a single Mustang circling the bombers long after everyone else had broken away. No one had believed it could be true. Not until now, when the proof stood before them, silent and alive. Over the next hours, reports began to filter through command channels. Reconnaissance confirmed multiple German losses. Air crews from the bomber formations submitted identical statements describing a lone Mustang that had appeared out of nowhere, tearing into the Luftwaffe swarms and saving the entire group from destruction. Each story repeated the same impossible sequence: one man, 30 minutes, 12 kills. By evening, Howard's name had spread across every wing of the 8th Air Force. The myth had already begun to take shape, and even the most hardened veterans struggled to comprehend it. Yet for Howard himself, there was no sense of triumph. What he remembered most was not victory but survival. The smell of oil and gunpowder, the flicker of explosions outside his canopy, the weight of knowing that hundreds of men depended on his decisions in those 30 minutes. The exhilaration of combat had long since faded, leaving only reflection. He had seen the faces of the enemy through the glass of his gun sight. Young, determined and terrified. He had watched them burn, fall, and vanish into the clouds. It was the same pattern he had witnessed years earlier in Asia. The same rhythm of war that never truly changed. He had lived through it once more. And though history would call it heroism, he felt only the gravity of what survival cost. In the following days, the story reached higher command. Reports were cross-checked, gun camera footage reviewed, and witness statements compiled. Each piece confirmed what seemed beyond belief. Major James Howell Howard had, single-handedly and against overwhelming odds, protected an entire bomber formation from annihilation. His performance was described as one of the greatest acts of aerial courage in the history of combat aviation. The recommendation came swiftly: the Medal of Honor. Weeks later, in a cold English hangar converted for ceremony, the medal was placed in his hands. The cameras flashed, and General spoke of valor, leadership, and the indomitable spirit of the American pilot. Howard stood motionless, his eyes distant. He accepted the award with quiet humility, but inside, he thought only of the mission, of the sky, the chaos, the burning trails, and the men who had not returned from other fights. To him, courage was never about glory. It was about endurance, the ability to face fear and move forward anyway. Back in the United States, his story swept through newspapers and radio broadcasts. Headlines called him the one-man Air Force, the pilot who fought 30 alone. Germans alone. Children memorized his name, and fellow airmen found in his actions a renewed sense of pride. The image of his silver Mustang, streaked with bullet holes yet still flying, became a symbol of American resilience, proof that determination could triumph over possible odds. But Howard never allowed fame to change him. He returned to flying soon after, continuing missions over Europe until the war's end. He treated every sortie the same: calm, disciplined, and focused. His men often noticed how quiet he was before takeoff, how he would sit in the cockpit long before the engine started, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as though preparing not just for combat, but for the weight of history that came with it. As the war drew to a close, the skies over Europe finally began to clear. Cities that had burned for years fell silent again, and the young pilots who had survived returned home to a nation that would never fully understand what they had endured. For James Howard, peace was not relief but reflection. He had seen what courage looked like when there was no choice left but to fight. He had lived the moment when one man's decision changed the fate of hundreds, and he carried that memory with him. Long after the medals were displayed and the headlines faded, years later, when historians revisited the air war over Germany, they often cited his mission at Oschersleben as the ultimate example of individual heroism in modern warfare, a moment when sheer willpower overcame the laws of probability. Military academies studied it, filmmakers reimagined it, and generations of pilots would grow up hearing his name whispered with reverence. Howard himself rarely spoke of that day. When he did, his words were simple. He had done what needed to be done. The real victory, he believed, belonged to the men who never returned, to the bombers that survived to fly another mission, and to the belief that courage was not born from the absence of fear, but from the refusal to surrender to it. And so in the cold clarity of that January morning, in a sky that belonged to no one but the wind, Major James Howell Howard became more than a pilot. He became the embodiment of a nation's spirit. The moment when a single man, outnumbered and alone, decided that retreat was not an option. For 30 minutes above Germany, he rewrote what it meant to be fearless. Time moved on, but history never let go of that morning. The war ended, cities rebuilt, and the world that once bled from the skies tried to find peace again. Yet somewhere above the memory of those clouds, the legend of one man endured, not because of medals, not because of headlines, but because of what it revealed about courage itself. Major James Howell Howard returned home to a country eager to celebrate its heroes. To the American public, he was a living symbol of victory, the pilot who had defied logic and turned the impossible into fact. His Medal of Honor was displayed in glass cases, his story told in schools, his name printed on the pages of history books. But to the men who had been in those bombers, he was something else entirely: a silent guardian who had appeared in their darkest hour and turned certain death into survival. They remembered the glint of his Mustang cutting through the German swarm, the thin silver shape standing between them in oblivion. To them, James Howard was not just a hero. He was the reason they had lived long enough to go home. Howard never sought attention for what he had done. In interviews, when pressed about the mission, his answers were brief, almost understated. To him, that 30-minute battle was not a story of glory but of responsibility. It was a moment where duty left no room for hesitation. Every second of that fight had been driven by instinct and by the unspoken bond that connected every man in the air. Each bomber he protected carried 10 crewmen, 10 families, 10 futures waiting on the ground. He knew it then, and it guided every decision he made that day. As the decades passed, jet engines replaced propellers, and the skies he once ruled with his Mustang became the domain of supersonic aircraft and digital systems. The world changed, but the essence of his act remained timeless. In every U.S. Air Force Academy classroom where courage was defined, in every museum where the Mustang's silhouette hung from the ceiling, the name James H. Howard still meant something profound, the measure of what one person can do when everything depends on him alone. The war eventually became history, studied and analyzed by those who had never heard the hum of engines over enemy lines. But the story of that single mission refused to fade. It lived in the hearts of the men who witnessed it, and in the quiet reverence of those who came after. Military historians described it as the most extraordinary single-handed air combat engagement of the Second World War. For many, it was proof that heroism was not born from grand strategy or numbers, but from the rare moment when one man decides that fear has no power over him. Howard lived a long life after the war, serving his country in various capacities, mentoring young aviators, and carrying himself with the same humility that had defined him in the sky. Even in his later years, when his body grew frail and his hair turned gray, there remained a calm steadiness in his eyes, the same eyes that had looked down upon a battlefield of clouds and fire and refused to turn away. When he finally passed, the Air Force saluted not only a man but a legacy. Today, his Medal of Honor rests as a quiet testament to those 30 minutes over Germany. The P-51 Mustang, restored and polished, stands in museums under bright lights, its name Ding Hao still gleaming on the fuselage. Visitors often walk past it, admiring the aircraft's design, unaware that every dent and scar once carried the weight of history. Somewhere between those rivets and scratches lies the story of a pilot who refused to retreat, who faced 30 enemies alone and emerged victorious, not for himself, but for the hundreds behind him. In the great ledger of war, where numbers often overshadow names, Howard's story remains the kind that defines a generation. It speaks of endurance, of courage unbent by fear, and of the rare moment when one man's resolve changes the fate of many. And so when historians speak of air power, when young pilots look to the past for meaning, they return to that single, frozen morning, January 11, 1944, above the city of Oschersleben, where a lone silver Mustang cut through a sky filled with enemies and rewrote the limits of human courage. For 30 minutes, Major James Howell Howard stood alone in the heavens. And for the rest of history, he has never truly been forgotten.